Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio, everyone. I'm your host for today's show, James Phillips from the UK chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement and TZM Education. Hope you're doing well out there. Today's show is going to feature an interview from UK chapter member Mel Marley concerning her talk that she gave at ZDAY London this year, 2016, on the psychology of effective communication and activism. We are a movement based around shifting people's values, understandings, and education towards the kind of problems that exist inherently in the current system which this planet operates under, and what an alternative might be. Now, that's quite a mission, and there's several things that we need to be well versed on, and clearly as a an awareness group, a communicative group, if you will, one of those abilities and understandings that we should have is how to communicate effectively. It's not always so easy. Sometimes a direct approach is a good thing. And sometimes it's terrible. My understandings of the science of communication is that if someone is on the fence, then a direct approach can work on a particular issue. But usually the best method is to find extensionality with that person and sympathize with the need behind what it is they're actually trying to put forth and what have you. So before I go off on too lengthy a rant, right here at the beginning of the show, I think it's probably best to just give a brief mention to something else, and that is these radio shows. If you would like to submit an interview with someone who is closely connected to the train of thought that we advocate, or perhaps even an interview with someone who disagrees with what it is we advocate, so that we can hear that conversation take place, or maybe just one of your own radio shows on one of your own topics for TZM Global Radio, then please do crack on with that. We are accepting submissions. To submit at thezeitgeistmovement.com, but also if you could send that to me either on Facebook, which is just, I'm sure you'll find me, James Phillips, on Facebook, or you can send them to my email at jamesshock@hotmail.co.uk. If you can get in touch there, then that would be greatly appreciated. We are a global movement. It's better when we have a community voice. It's better when we have more voices out there advocating what it is that we advocate and showing that we truly are a global movement. So please do that. Couple of pointers if you are considering making a radio show. Try to make it as short and concise as possible. Short and sweet is always good. I realise that's probably completely hypocritical coming from me, as I know I have done some lengthy ones in the past. But ultimately, make sure it's interesting to listen to. Again, maybe some of you out there are going, yeah, whatever, mate, you bore me to tears. But hopefully I don't. Obviously, make sure the sound quality is decent enough, and don't include any unsolicited material in the middle of your recordings. YouTube will just go apeshit on us because it's all about intellectual property, as if something was even a rational proposition. But anyway, moving away from that and back to the subject of today's show. As I was saying, Mel Marley and myself conducted an interview about her talk given at ZDAY London 2016, which was a really great event. We had only guest speakers, if you exclude myself and Mel, and we had all sorts of different groups that are roughly connected to some aspect of the train of thought that we advocate, whether it is an appreciation and understanding of the scientific method and how that's carried out, or what local sustainability groups are doing in interconnecting those groups digitally and locally, and all many different groups. The plan at the moment is to perhaps feature some of those talks on the global YouTube channel, but we already have all of them up and ready to view at the UK Zeitgeist Movement channel. So if you type in TZM UK into YouTube, you can go and watch them there now. But we are going to conduct a series of interviews with each speaker from the day to sort of expand upon the topic that they discussed that day. So this is the first instalment in those, this discussion between myself and Mel. So I think that's about it from me. I think we'll just crack on with the interview, and I hope you enjoy it and get something out of it. There won't be any talking done at the end of the show. It'll just cut. So I will say my goodbyes now, and I will speak to you all again soon on the next radio show. So take care of yourselves, guys, and speak to you soon. Bye. Okay, I'd like to welcome Mel Marley from TZM UK to the show. Hi, Mel. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good.
If you could just, if we got started with a brief introduction, if you could just introduce yourself, how you found TZM and got involved with the movement, maybe for starters, that would be great.
Well, I came across the movement at the end of 2010 when a friend of mine told me about it, and then another friend happened to have it on his computer. So I was like, oh, you got a movie that someone told me to watch. Is it any good? And that's sort of how it started. And then a few weeks later, another friend of mine happened to be showing the third movie at my university. So after that, it kind of really kicked off.
And what was the sort of, if you could give us a brief outline to what you discussed at London ZDAY 2016, and why you thought that was an important topic to discuss amongst the people present, that would be great.
Well, this year at London ZDAY, I was talking about the psychology, the science behind effective activism, how to change people's minds and behavior, and debunk myths. Quite often, people have their own vague ideas of what to do, but they don't really know whether it works, and often they don't even follow up or check whether it's working. So I thought that was something that would be worth talking about. And it's also something that people ask a lot. So why is it so hard to change people's minds? I keep trying to tell them the facts, but they just won't listen. What do I do?
Yes, that is a very common statement made by people involved in the Zeitgeist movement. I think we've got to bear in mind that what we're talking about is very far outside. Although I would argue, and I'm sure you probably agree, it's in its simplest form. It's just common sense and logic, but it does run counter to so many of our cultural norms and traditions that are ingrained in modern life. I talk about this. I've talked about communication at great length on this show and in other mediums, because there is a science to communication, and I wonder if you could maybe discuss some of the points that came out in your lecture about some of the things that might be surprising in how they work.
I found it very surprising that something like the majority more influential at changing people's behaviors than just giving them the facts, like, climate change is a big threat to humanity, but people are unlikely to act on it just by knowing the facts. But if their neighbors are doing it, then that suddenly changes everything. And also about the debunking myths, for example, that bringing up the topic and saying that, oh, this isn't true, can actually have the opposite effect and will instead strengthen the false belief. So that was quite surprising as well.
Yes, I think the first thing you mentioned about the sort of groupthink mentality, I think feeds into the Asch Experiment, which you very briefly went through in your lecture. Would you like to maybe flesh that one out and discuss that? Because I find that particularly intriguing.
Yeah, that was quite bizarre and even a little bit funny when there's a video of it on YouTube, so that's quite funny to watch. So the experiment is presented as a visual task. So the participants are shown three lines and a target line, and they have to say which of the three lines is the same length. But there's other people in the room answering before the participant, and if they give the wrong answer, then the participant often thinks that, oh, well, everyone else said that answer. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe I'm seeing things wrong, and then they often give the wrong answer as well.
Yes, they doubt their own mind. In fact, I think the percentages were that up to 90% of participants went with the group, even though you could visibly see that the line is shorter. So they doubt their own mind in face of the group mentality. I don't suppose really it should be that surprising psychologically if you're left out to fend by yourself without being part of your tribe in terms of evolutionary success. That isn't very good news.
But on the other hand, if there was at least one other person who also gave that answer, then pretty much everyone felt safe to go against the majority. So that was another thing that came out of that experiment, which was interesting.
Yeah, and I think that should hopefully give our people, members of the Zeitgeist movement, some hope and pause for reflection. I mean, I think there's also other elements that you discussed as well psychologically, like our own bias. So coming back to what you said earlier about our own bias feeding into how we communicate as well. I suppose we generally feel like we communicate fine, and the problem is with the other person, rather than looking at our methods. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, surely it's very hard to realize that maybe your methods aren't the best. Maybe you're being a bit, well, maybe you're being a bit too much like attacking the other person's identity, or well, which is something you see on the internet a lot, when people just go, oh, why can't you see that? And often it turns into a bit of a flame war that way, and it's then hard to sort of step back from it.
Yeah, I think it is, and I suppose it sort of instigates our flight or fight mechanism in our brain, and we think we're being attacked, and so we attack back. It doesn't give you many options, really, when someone attacks you. You either defend or you attack back, which could be classified as the same thing. So I wonder where the line in the sand is on this, and whether where you sort of venture over into what some people might call manipulation or manipulative techniques in communication and not being genuine. I wonder what you would think about that.
Do you mean like using these techniques ethical, or?
Perhaps in some contexts. I suppose. I mean, I don't really have a problem with this. I've been to events such as Christian festivals. And I've gone there one year dressed as Christopher Hitchens and telling everybody, how it's all ridiculous it all is. And then went the following year to promote the RBE as a Christian, as a makeshift Christian. Obviously, I wasn't. I did it as a manipulative technique, and it worked much better than my prior technique. But some people did raise the question, well, that's lying, and it's manipulative and everything. And I don't know, I don't see it that way. But I suppose if you're deliberately changing your course of action, there's a line there between whether you're being genuine anymore or whether you're deliberately being manipulative. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, of course, one danger here is that if you get found out, then obviously that's going to backfire on you. But if you know that you're not going to meet that particular group anymore, then sometimes you might think that maybe the ends justify the means. But of course, in the end, there's also the question of if you have essentially manipulated someone into believing what you believe and getting on board with it, then are they going to actually really engage with your message, or are you just sort of going along with it because it's cool or because someone else did it?
I think there's definitely something to be said for not being found out. That would definitely backfire, and it wouldn't be recommended. But I think I sort of said to somebody, well, I think we're being manipulative pretty much all of the time in one way. We all self-edit ourselves. There's certain jokes you might say in certain social contexts that you wouldn't say in others, and certain phrases that you might pass in certain company and not in others. So I would argue that you can call it manipulation if you want, but I would call it just self-censorship, really, and intelligent self-censorship. So I also wanted to briefly mention something else. Is that I felt like this fed into this idea of other people around you wanting to go forward with an idea fed into the Transition Towns interview I've just done as well, where that's a sort of local initiative to do sustainability drives. Now, I know many in our movement would argue that that's patchwork, and I would argue that it is, in terms of the system disorder that we currently sort of prevail under our economy is not economic, it's based on growth and consumption. But I feel like transition towns, it almost, maybe without them even realizing it, are a good way of communicating the message, because you're pulling people in without a big grand message, but more just a community spirit and getting people on board that way. Do you feel that way about that as well, Mel? And do you have anything to add about the other speakers that you had on ZDAY and ZDAY in general, perhaps?
Yeah, I definitely think that all sorts of community initiatives are very good at getting the message out there, because then it'll be people you know, people who are like you, and you're more likely to be receptive to a message if it's presented by someone who is like you, even if you were previously not very engaged with environmentally friendly living. Then just because your neighbors and your, I don't know, community leaders are promoting it, you might just get involved with it just because of that, and then as a result sort of learn more about it and find more reasons to get into it. And well, as I was talking about identity in my talk, it will help you see yourself more as a sort of person who cares about this sort of thing.
Yeah, perhaps if you could expand on that last point a little bit more about seeing yourself in a new and different light. Is there any expansion you could give on that, perhaps?
So the thing about identity is that generally we tend to do things that we have done in the past and don't really change that much. There was an experiment that was trying to get people to do something they normally wouldn't do. So what they did was had these large signs saying drive safely, and they wanted people to put them up in their front yard. But when they just went and knocked on people's doors and, is it okay if we put this sign in your front yard? Then most people were like, no, not really. But when they started with a smaller request at first, went to a different group of people just with little window stickers, then people were quite okay to put these little window stickers on their windows. And then when they came back 2 weeks later, and they found that, well, at first it was 17% of people who were okay with those signs, but then after the window stickers, it jumped to about 60% of people who were like now suddenly okay with putting the drive safely sign. It's because just a small act of person who cares about the cause of driving safely.
I think that feeds back into the topic we were just talking about quite nicely as well, because if we as members of the movement actually engage in our local community sustainability drives, such as transition towns, and maybe befriend the members there as well, at some later point we can give a talk to the members who are already moving in that direction, and genuinely in movements like that, they really are from many different walks of life. And if we can then get our message across to those groups, then and get them thinking about larger systems at play, then I think that's going for the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, rather than standing out in the street and randomly handing out flyers, which we do. And I don't know, in the right location it might be the right thing, but we definitely have to be conscious of how we moving forward with this, and that's why the area that you were talking about on ZDAY is so critical. As a communication movement, if you don't know the science of communication, you are a little bit buggered, for want of a better phrase. Now, I had some other points down here that we perhaps wanted to discuss as well, which you didn't maybe necessarily expand upon at great length in your talk. So, number one being dress style and first impressions in terms of psychology and how that affects us. And maybe you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit, please.
Talk I was talking about, well, showing the video of the guy in a tie and talking about Milgram's experiment with the guy in a lab coat. So that's one way to go about it, to dress as an authority figure. But on the other hand, you also have to keep in mind what your audience is and what sort of impression you want to give. Because, well, for example, if you're going into like communities or trying to start a community project, then that has to do with like digging and gardening. Then maybe wearing a suit and a tie would be a bit funny and out of place. So you'll probably want to dress more in a sort of, well, basically in the same way that other people would. So maybe a bit more casual in that sense, in that case. But yeah, it's really about sort of considering your situation and your audience.
Yes, I agree. I mean, something that struck me of a global Z-Day event a few years ago in LA was that all the speakers were dressed in some kind of smart shirt or smart suit and things. And even in my own head, it came across as, damn, this looks so professional. You know, it looks like a TED event, and it looks like these guys really know what they're talking about and what they're doing, and it just looked polished. And it really does. It really does add something when you could argue it doesn't really matter. I mean, I've heard a thing about Einstein that he used to just have a load of identical suits in his closet, you know, and his partner used to say, well, why don't you, you know, you need a different suit for this occasion, and he just couldn't see it because he's like, well, it was about the information, it's not about anything else. But in some, not that I'd question Einstein, but in certain, and I suppose his reputation preceded him, so it wouldn't have mattered too much. But in most circles, I think it does matter whether, you know, what you're wearing and the first impressions that you make. I believe that our first impressions are very important. I remember hearing an experiment done about that. I don't suppose you could expand on that because its memory escapes me at the moment.
I do recall an experiment about job interviews where they found that often the interviewers made the decision in like the first 2 seconds or something like that, just from the moment the person walked in, just the way they dressed, the way they walked, the way they shook the hand or something like that. So yeah, it's definitely true, and if you're not conscious of it, then it'll probably be something that will bias you in the way you judge someone.
Yeah, that's truly fascinating and ever so slightly terrifying at the same time. You know, when you think about it with regards to those sorts of social situations and things, but it really should just take a bit of thought. And I was just thinking that many of these examples, it brings up a book that I think we talked about. I can't remember. I've discussed it with a few people now, called Influence. Have you heard of that book?
Yeah, I haven't read Influence myself.
The subtitle's The Psychology of Persuasion. I brought it up very briefly in a talk I gave for the movement at the global event in Berlin. But once again, it's worth putting it out there because it's definitely got some useful material in it that sort of gives us both some techniques that marketers would use on people to try to get them to buy their products. But you can look at it in that light, or you can look at it in the sense that, well, these are just techniques that work, you know, and we can ignore them at our peril or use them. And so speaking of techniques and moving on to another one I wanted to discuss, what can you outline perhaps a little bit more the worldview backfire effect? I think we sort of maybe skirted across this topic a little earlier, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
So it essentially means that where your political leanings or worldview in general opinion. So, for example, trying to talk about climate change with Republicans is going to be difficult because traditionally the Republican Party doesn't believe in man-made climate change. So it'll be very difficult to change someone's mind about it. So there's ways around it. For example, you can choose a messenger who appears to be, well, if another person who is also a Republican will be trying to change the person's mind, it'll be more likely to succeed. And also because this is about sort of a threat to self-identity, start off by affirming that person's self-identity and values. Obviously, not the one that you're trying to change, something else about the person. If you help them feel better about themselves and their values, and only then start talking about the topic that threatens their self-identity, then you're likely going to have a bit more success.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I suppose it's an advocating the sort of wolf in sheep's clothing, the man on the inside type approach to things, which is fine, really. It brings up a lot of Jacques Fresco's stories that he speaks about, like the one of the Ku Klux Klan. Have you are you familiar with that story that Jacques sometimes tells about how he brought the Klan in Miami round to away from their sort of despotic views?
No, I'm afraid I haven't heard about that one. Would you like to talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning because it brings up what we're discussing quite nicely. Jacques basically was designing different designs and technology and things, and the head of the Klan in Miami was quite interested in those things, so he invited him over to his house. Got him quite impressed in what his work was, and the guy said, "Do you want to come over to the the Klan meetings and show some of your ideas to the boys?" And he did. And the members said to Jacques, "Well, so what do you think of the Klan?" And he said, "I think you're good, but I don't think you go far enough, personally." So you can see his techniques there, straight from the off, and so affirming their identity, so to speak, winning their trust, winning their favour. Once he was involved in them. He was giving them talks on technology and things, and they started to respect him in that area. He gave them a talk one day with a blank video screen in front of it, and played a voice that was very posh English and aristocracy. Sounded like it was from Oxford University, and he asked them, what face they thought matched the voice as a sort of game, and they said, "Oh, probably white, upper class English." And of course, he turned on the screen, and the person was black. So, and in their language, as Jacques explains it, they said, you mean, that they can read and write, and they're intelligent, and he's like, yep, yep. And they said, blimey, and he at least claimed that it disbanded the Klan. In a matter of no time at all. So I think it's a nice example of how to get in behind people's psychological defenses.
Were they not were they not angry about him like tricking them about it?
Well, I say that's a good question. I'd be very interested to ask Jacques that question. I don't know. I mean, it is just a story. I don't suppose there's any way of verifying it, but I know that technique works because I used it. I've used it in a few examples. The one being the Christian festival that I went to. I suppose everybody could say, well, that's just a story as well, but it's very difficult sometimes to gauge how far you've got with people. I mean, people seemed to be far more receptive when I used those types of techniques than when I didn't. I suppose maybe the anger is quelled slightly by the fact that he'd already won their favour. They already respected him, and he'd already assimilated to their views. I suppose that can't hurt. So, and the other thing I wanted to discuss was, to a certain extent, do we really want people who can be easily swayed by these sorts of techniques involved in the communication of them? I suppose people who are easily convinced that an idea makes sense. So, do we want those sorts of people on board at this stage? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a risk to take, because if you do end up with those people on board, maybe they'll then come on the message boards or the Facebook groups and then have a completely wrong idea of what the movement is about, and start posting like conspiracy theories, or be like, "Oh, what do you mean you're not supporting religion?" Or, "What about my beliefs? I want to talk about my beliefs." And it might derail the discussion, and also they might not be very active in the movement, really. But yeah, I think what you said earlier about sort of finding the low fruit, finding the people who are already halfway there, who have already sort of, for example, if they advocate recycling, or even little things like switch off the lights when you leave a room. Once they're doing those things, it's already a bit more part of their identity again, and then just maybe using the techniques like to nudge them a little bit more, like just make it a bit easier for them to take the next step, and encourage them and show them that, oh yeah, see, other people are doing it as well, you're not alone, you know and it's fun. And then they might gradually lose their resistance to the more grand ideas that we advocate as well.
Well, I think I agree with precisely with what you just said, and I would argue that with the people who may be more susceptible to those techniques and maybe might that are therefore maybe easily swayed by arguments, or too quickly they arrive at what they believe to be the truth because of their own worldview bias, because of their own leanings. I think we've all been guilty of that at some point in our life, and I think it's a risk worth taking personally. Because personally speaking, there was an awful lot of things because of my worldview that I used to believe in that I no longer believe in, having joined the movement and looked more avidly at science, reason, logic, critical thinking, logical fallacies. All of those sorts of subjects have steered me away from things that I would be comfortable for me to believe, given a sort of anti-establishment feeling I had in general when I came to this movement, but I find myself leaning away from those views now. And as I said, I certainly didn't start off like that. So if I can use myself as a case study, then I think it does show a sort of good example. I just don't think we should necessarily write any group off. However, I think we'd also be biting off our noses despite our face to say that we shouldn't go for the low-hanging fruit, and the people that are going to get this idea more readily than those who aren't, so to speak. So to sort of finish up, Mel, is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel you'd like to mention, or any work that you're doing coming up that you'd like to give a plug or anything?
Well, I don't really know where I'm gonna go next. I've started reading a book about trust in society, which might be an interesting topic for a future Z-Day to talk about. It's always difficult to advocate these ideas where they're about sharing and cooperation, when there's often the doubt that, oh, but is it possible to do this on a large scale? Can you trust human nature? And so it would be interesting to know a bit more about that. And on the other hand, I'm also interested in things like personal development and productivity. So maybe that might be another avenue to explore, find out the science about how to get things done effectively, because that would probably help people in the movement as well. I don't know. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. It would certainly help me. I am guilty of procrastinating more often than I'd care to admit. So I would love to hear a talk about that. And it's interesting, the link of social trust to income inequality as well. Just yet another one of those not necessarily instantly mentionable links, but one that's not basically it's not mentioned by people in public discourse. Just like teenage pregnancy, the first thing that springs to your head is not, well, that's because we live in a more unequal society, or that's one of the major contributing factors. People would go, well, sorry, what? You'd have to second take that that's the first thing that would come into your mind. And yet, for movement members at least, it is, as long as they've looked at those materials, and if they haven't, I sincerely recommend that you do. In terms of personal development and things of that nature, if you might be interested, and I still need to have a look at it, but Adamantium, one of our members, gave a talk at his Z-Day in Brighton on that topic. So if you get a chance, I would check that out. And I suppose just another brief thing, a question I was supposed to ask earlier, but what was your impression of the London Z-Day event? How did you feel it went? And what was your sort of take-home moment? What did you enjoy the most from that event?
I thought it was a really good event. Like, we had such a range of speakers from all sorts of groups. So yeah, I really like how we're starting to work more with other groups and link up with initiatives that share our ideals, and so we're not just talking about things. There's also actual like projects about more concrete things to get involved with which I highly recommend people to do. Like if you find anything in your local area that does even something as simple as community growing, then that's definitely something to get involved in, and you can always find other people there who are interested in the same topics as you. And yeah, that was definitely something really good about the event.
Yes, I agree. I think that's how we've there's two. I think that's how we've got to progress this thing. Really, as I said earlier, you could argue that transition towns might be seen as patchwork, but and I think that's a very negative view now. I used to argue that because of the movement's larger system order disorder that we sort of talk about. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the low hanging fruit exists, and it is changing values, and ultimately it is starving the beast just that little bit more. And if everybody in their local communities can do that, that can't be a bad thing. So I think that's probably a nice note to end on. Your talk is being edited currently and will be up on both the UK and the global channel, hopefully not in the too distant future. So I recommend everybody to go and check that out. But I would just like to say, yeah, thanks very much for joining us today, Mel, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you again soon.
Was my pleasure being on the radio, and yeah, hope to have more zeitgeist happenings in the future. And well, I might not be in this country anymore next year, but wherever I end up going, definitely gonna stay in touch with the movement.
Brilliant. Okay, well, yes, and yeah, I mean, I've always said because of the global nature of this movement, I'll always know where to look for my newfound friends when I arrive somewhere. So yeah, I can definitely concur. So thanks very much, Mel, and speak to you soon.
Good night.